Hey everyone, and welcome to Developer Tea. My name is Jonathan Cottrell, and in today's episode, I have the pleasure of interviewing Pythonista Kenneth Reitz. Kenneth is the author of quite a few open source tools, including Requests and more recently, Records, both of which attempt to make the software development process more human. We will talk more about what that means in today's episode, as well as the next episode of Developer Tea. If you don't want to miss out on that part of the interview, make sure you subscribe to Developer Tea in whatever podcasting app you use. Today's episode is sponsored by Hired.com. If you are a designer or a developer and you're looking for a job and you want a little bit of an extra bonus, quite literally, Hired may be the perfect place for you to start. We'll talk more about that bonus later on in today's episode. But first, I want to jump straight into the interview with Kenneth Reitz. Kenneth, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you about all of the open source projects that you have created. And later on, you mentioned burnout with open source. We're going to talk about that as well. But first, I want to hear about how you got into programming and specifically what interested you about Python.
Well, I got into programming. I was always fascinated with computers as a kid. One of my favorite toys as a child was playing with paint on the Windows 3.1 machine my dad had.
Sure, yeah.
And so, I was just always trying to get as much time either playing a Nintendo or being on a computer as possible. And my old church gave me, I was like in fourth grade. They had this really old, it was an IBM XT machine that was like sitting in there in the corner. And the pastor said I could take it home one day. It's because no one was using it, obviously. So I had my own computer finally. And I spent like 8 hours a day on that thing for the longest time. It came with DOS 3 and it had a 20 meg hard drive. I learned BASIC. I had a like a kid's BASIC book that I had got a hold of. And I taught myself BASIC. And
how old were you?
So it was like fourth grade, so probably 9 or 10. And, and then over the years, I always had this antiquated hardware. So I was always learning really old technology. But I learned C, really basic C, just like functions and printing and doing the PC speaker and stuff like that. And it's great. I got it up on a website that every ISP used to give people like a little slot to put a website up on back in the day. And for some reason, that account it's still online. So I found that recently.
Wow.
And just last night, I went and I got the EXEs that I had generated from my first software package for my friends.
I saw that you tweeted this out today.
It was called Splashware, and it's running on archive.org, and you can run it on your browser. I'm pretty excited about that.
I couldn't tell if this was a virus when I ran it, actually. They recently released the archive of viruses.
Oh, yeah, that was excellent.
It's like malware that you can go and safely view through your browser somehow.
Yes. Yeah. Jason Scott and the archive team, they do incredible work.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So Splashware. Yeah,
so that was like C, and that was like middle school type stuff. And, HTML. And I always got books from the library. And they would have those CDs in the back. That's where I'd get my software from. And I would teach myself by reading all these books. And I kind of put it down for a long time, but I was still like a technical computer user. I was a heavy Linux user. So, that comes with the territory. And then I was really torn when it came time to go to college. What I wanted to do. I had spent like 10 years spending most of my time drumming instead of doing computers. I kind of switched. And I was like, I could go on that path, or I could be a photographer, or I could do this, that. And I sat down and I decided to go with computer science because then I could fund all those other things as hobbies. And, the best career choice would be computer science. So I went to school. And the first language that they taught me was Python. Luckily.
Wow. What school is this?
George Mason University.
Okay.
Yeah, CS 112 was a Python course. They taught it terribly. Like, I can't even begin to tell you. It was taught by a Java guy. They didn't know what they were doing.
Well, and I was getting ready to say that. Typically, these courses, especially the early CS courses, are Java.
Yeah. Yeah, they typically are. There's a trend in universities to switch to Python now, and it's more and more doing it every year. Even MIT is teaching Python now.
Yeah, that's why I was asking, what school it was, because it seems like a forward-thinking switch to move to Python for that early course.
No, I'm not much of a school guy, so I went to class maybe 5 times, and I got really frustrated. I couldn't learn what they were teaching, so I just went off and stayed in my dorm and taught myself Python. And then I learned it much better than the class taught.
They say there's only one way to write a Python program, though.
Oh, one and preferably one way to do it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It was just a crazy class. I can't even... I don't want to go there.
All right.
So, but then I dropped out of school because, like I said, school isn't for me. And I just kept programming, basically. And I went away from Python because I was using Python to build like command line stuff. Mm-hmm. And then I started doing web stuff. And so I learned PHP, and I was doing PHP a lot and learning how to manage servers with all the Linux knowledge I had, and did a little bit of Java and a little bit of everything. Then I came back home to Python one day and realized I could do everything in Python. And,
I was going to say, somebody showed you Flask or something.
Well, it didn't exist at the time, but it was great. There's being able to, like, I went from a job where my first tech job was doing like PHP. My second one was doing .NET and SharePoint customization.
It's very different from Python.
Very, very, very. It was interestingly fun, but only for like a couple of weeks. C# is a cool language. SharePoint is not cool in any way, shape, or form. I left that job 3 months later to choose open source technology, basically. And it was a job where like they had a bunch of client contracts, and it was just written in a bunch of open source stuff. Every project was a different language. And so I just learned a ton of stuff there. And then I was finally able to get a job doing Python full time. And that's when I was finally happy.
And was that when you moved to Heroku?
No, I was working at NetApp at the time, working on some migration software. And then I went from there to a company called Readability, which is a competitor to Instapaper. And then from there to Heroku.
Tell the listeners what you do at Heroku as the product owner of Python.
So I call myself the Python overlord. And basically that means that everything about Heroku that is involved, that it relates to Python, I'm responsible for. So when you push up a Python application, all the code that gets executed to run your app, I manage all that, all the documentation, all the customer experience stuff, support tickets, making sure that we have great presence in the community and that the community's needs are being met by the platform as well.
Sure. Yeah. So you end up speaking a lot.
Yes.
So what are some of the conferences that you've been at, and are you planning to be at some this year? Or
so PyCon every year is my favorite conference. I like to highlight every, like, how most people measure their years and like the progress that they're making in life by New Year's every year.
Sure.
For me, it's when PyCon is.
That's when you make your resolutions for the year.
Yeah, because I get to really reflect on like, what have I done in the community since the last time I saw all of these people, or what else has changed. It's pretty interesting.
That's really cool. So would you say that the Python community is growing, or that it's full of a lot of veterans, or how does the Python community feel to you as the Python overlord, so to speak?
The Python community as a whole is definitely always growing. I do not think it's growing as fast as languages like the Node.js community.
Sure.
And the growth of Node is absolutely tremendous if you look at everything in that community. And Python is a much more steady, rigid ecosystem.
Sure.
Yeah.
I would say it's kind of fundamentally different Well, first of all, it's significantly older than the Node community, right?
It's older than Java.
Wow. So what was your 94? Is that when Python was written?
That sounds about right.
It was around the same time that Ruby was released, but the Python community grew early and it was used on so many platforms early and probably gained a lot of popularity as a result of that.
Yeah. And now with all the web technologies being available, Rails came out and that gave Ruby a tremendous amount of popularity. And Django was released, I believe, shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
That kind of started a resurgence of interest in the languages from a new set of people.
Sure. And there are a lot of similarities. If you're listening to this podcast right now and you tried Ruby and you didn't like it, you may like Python, but they are very similar. There are certain differences that I would say are pretty significant and make a big difference in the way you code, but it's very similar in terms of the utility of the language. The one thing that I think, across the board, Python kind of wins is the portability. Python can be deployed on like many more machines, for example, than Ruby can in large. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, it's
So Python is used in robotics, for example, where you don't really hear about Ruby being used in robotics that often.
Yeah, it definitely has a much larger application usage base. You can use it for scientific computing. They use it at CERN for the Big Hadron Collider, satellite stuff. Like it's used for all kinds of things. And Ruby is technically capable of those things, but it's just not a good fit for a lot of those things, as Python is.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing as to why. And this actually is a pretty good segue to talk to you a little bit about some of your projects, because a lot of the draw of Ruby is the approachable nature of the syntax. There are a lot of very natural feeling things that are baked right into Ruby core or into a core library. And I'm wondering, because you have quite a few projects, most specifically, recently you've done records, and before that you did requests. These are projects that are focused on this idea. You use the word human a lot in your work. Can you kind of expound on what it means to create more human-friendly interfaces to code?
Sure. So when I created requests, originally the tagline was HTTP that doesn't suck. And it took many iterations, but I wanted it to be less negative, but still kind of assert that this is something better than or more usable than. So I ended up settling on HTTP for humans. And basically what that means is if you look at the way... let me explain what request does first. So it has a tremendous amount of functionality, but the basic concept is when you send an HTTP request in Python, if you try to use the standard tools that are available, it is like the worst experience you could possibly have. And especially if you want to do simple things like deal with cookies, set headers, have authentication, follow redirects. All these things can be done, but it's not a good experience by any means. Like, you're going to spend hours on this, and you'll probably break something in the process that you probably won't do it right. So for humans is the idea of I'm human. This is what I expect to be able to do. Make it do that. Mm-hmm. And so I write a library that does that, basically. It does all the crazy stuff in the background so that everything just works properly. So it really encourages best practices. And it's great.
Today's episode is sponsored by Hired. On Hired, software engineers and designers can get 5 or more interview requests in a given week. Each of these offers has salary and equity up front, and they have full-time and contract opportunities. Now, you as the user, you can view the interview requests and accept or reject them before you ever even talk to the company, so you avoid any kind of awkward interactions. Hired works with over 3,000 companies, from startups to large public companies, and they have employers from 13 major tech hubs in North America and Europe. Now, the best part for you is that it's totally free, and there's no reason not to try this if you're looking for a job. And if you end up getting a job through Hired, they typically give you a $1,000 thank you bonus. But if you use the special link in the show notes, that bonus doubles to $2,000 when you accept the job. So go and check it out. It's hired.com/developer-T. Of course, that link will be in the show notes at spec.fm. Thanks again to Hired for sponsoring Developer T. So I assume, based on my limited knowledge of Python, but also of your specific tools, I assume that you do a lot of kind of default things to help users accomplish the most common goals. Because HTTP, very often what you want to do is just, perform a GET request and get something back and do something with it, right? Same thing with post requests. You may want to post a request with some headers and get something back in a particular format. There are so many other things that you could do with HTTP, but 95% of the time, that's what I want to do, right?
Yes.
So can you kind of speak to the idea of, I guess some people call it sensible defaults, but this concept of the most common thing, making that the most accessible thing?
Definitely. So I do have a rule with the libraries that I write, and it's basically is to try to fit the 95% use case and to ignore the rest of the people. Because there's a lot of people who will come along in a project and be like, I really need to do this thing for my job. And here's a pull request that adds like 100 lines of code that no one will ever be able to maintain. And so I don't do that, basically. Over time, the API has become more powerful and I've made it modular so people can augment the code. But like the core library itself is like, it does what it does. So a few things we do for sensible defaults are, so when you grab an HTTP request, let's see, you do request.get and you give it a URL. You're going to get back a blob of binary data from the server, right? And that gets stored in the object. And so there's two ways to access that. There is the .content, which is the bytes representation, the binary representation of the response. And then there's a .text representation, which is the Unicode representation. Now, servers sometimes report the encoding in their headers when they're responding. They sometimes don't. And sometimes when they do, they're lying. Very often when they do, they're lying. So when you have a response object in request, there's a .encoding attribute, which is set automatically based on A, the headers, and if that doesn't work, then B will actually detect the encoding from the content. And C, you can set it yourself if you definitely know what it is. And so you just basically never have to worry about content encoding when you're using the library. And that is really hard to do.
Yeah, that's if you've ever worked with a HTTP library, then you know how frustrating some of these things that you expect to be normal and easy can be. I've gone through so many Stack Overflow posts when I'm just trying to write a script to go grab some JSON and post a header, right? Even if it's and I typically do this with Ruby. And we have the net HTTP library, which is relatively approachable.
Yes. I actually really like that library. I use it as an example of a good workflow in some of my presentations compared to what you have to do in Python.
Right, sure. And it is very different. And even that still has its quirks, right? Because HTTP is not a super approachable thing because we don't think about all of these terms naturally, right? With an HTML document, we can kind of understand the idea of the whole document being the unit of HTML, and then you have a head, which is the head, and then you have the body, which makes up the bulk of what that thing is, and that kind of comes intuitively to us. But when you start talking about post and get and headers and body, none of these things naturally fit together in my mind, right? I have to read something to be able to understand what that is because there's not like a mental model that they're mapping that onto. It's all fundamentally new.
Interesting. Well, you should try requests. Maybe it'll help out.
There you go. And to be fair, I mean, there are quite a few good libraries in other spaces as well. So, there are some more natural things once you do understand that language. But making that language more approachable is a task, right? That's not an easy thing. And really, if you're going to create an open source library, I think this kind of library, the stuff that you're making, Kenneth, that focuses on the human side, which is I see a thing and I have to, wrap my brain around it. And there are certain ways that I naturally think, and then there are other ways where never in a million years would that come intuitively. I have to read the manual. I have to read the documentation to be able to do that thing. And things like requests or records, which I want to talk about next, they kind of help us get to that spot where we can make a good guess, and a lot of the time we're right.
Yes, definitely.
So it kind of sets up the rules, and you approach from the perspective of, for example, a common grammar, right? Any good Ruby library does this as well, where you can do one thing with one class, and then you do another thing with another class, and you expect it to do the right thing naturally. For example, concatenating strings, you just do a plus between them. And then when you do a plus between numbers, you're not getting a string back. You're going to get the numbers added, right? These are natural things. Those are intuitive things. There are some things that we still have yet to solve in software development that are not yet intuitive like that is. Does that make sense? Does it translate to the work that you're doing with these libraries?
Definitely. It's all about sensible defaults and just good API design. A lot of times there's APIs available that are just antiquated, or, they were built for a different time, or they're just bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or they fit a different use case. Sometimes the standard library that people are instructed to use is a little too low level because it's trying to fit that 100% use case.
Sure.
And so in order to use it 95% of the time, you have to do 20 things.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can build something on top of it that utilizes that functionality, then, the world is a better place.
I totally agree. I'm interested to know, what other types of software have you encountered that don't feel human, that you feel like still need some work?
So in the Python world, for me, the big one right now is date times.
I was going to mention this. You tweeted about this as well today.
I've talked about date times being needing improvement for a long time based on feedback from the community. But it's not something I've actually used. I always stick to UTC everything everywhere in my code. But I'm just trying to do the simplest little thing last night. I spent 4 hours on one line of code. I still haven't gotten it to work right. Now, I could have done it manually by just changing a string around, but I'm trying to use the API properly to do this, right? And it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So I want to build a date times for humans, but when I start looking at just the depth of what is going on there, it is absolutely astronomical. So I might not touch that. And there's some good implementations that are already available. There's one called Arrow for Python, which is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And just I know the amount of work I'd have to put into this to do it well, it might not. I don't know. It might not be worth my sanity.
Yeah, I think this is a ubiquitous problem. I would say, everybody makes the list of the hardest problems in computer science. If off by one errors make it to that list, then this is the epitome of off by one errors. Absolutely, in every case. The issue so often is, the server's time is slightly different. And then you have daylight savings time. And then what happens if the person is visiting, in a community where they actually are right on the line, right? Where they actually go back and forth between different date times, or between different time zones rather. And then, I actually heard somebody say, well, I'm going to write some code that basically takes the time from the International Space Station and applies it universally, because that's the only thing that makes sense. It's so true, though. Date time is a difficult one. There are some interesting libraries out there that I've used to try to solve some of these problems in the past. A good one for JavaScript is Moment. Have you used Moment for or have you written much date time oriented JavaScript?
I haven't written much JavaScript in a while, but I've definitely heard of Moment.js.
Yeah, it's kind of the go-to at this point. I think Ruby really handles date times decently well in the date class.
The datetime part's the easy part. It's the time zone that's the hard part.
Always the hard part.
For me, what I'm trying to do is I'm parsing from a string just a simple date, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get a datetime object back. And I want to specify that it is a US Eastern time zone.
Mm-hmm.
And US Eastern's fine because that means it'll change automatically between daylight savings times.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would like to render that string out as ISO. Nothing
Seems easy, doesn't it?
Well, it is easy until you want the code to work anywhere. And then I just can't get it to work. When there's a different locale on a different machine, it has different behavior. And I can't figure out the proper way to do it. And it's probably naivety. I've never used these modules before,
Mm-hmm.
but it shouldn't take me 4 hours to figure out how to do this.
That's true. That is true. I think that's really the key there, right? Like, sure, it's a problem and it does take time to solve, but there's a limit to how much time is really actually worth it to try to solve this kind of problem.
Yes, exactly. But then it goes a point further, like with HTTP, I was able to solve the problem for myself. And in doing so, I was able to solve this problem for the whole Python community. With the datetime thing, like if I was to try to solve the problem for myself, I think the amount of time involved might be exponentially higher. But I'm not sure yet. I have to do a lot of research. There's just so much consideration because I believe it's designed the way it is today for a reason, like to cover all these use cases.
Yeah.
That 100% use case. And so I can try to apply a 95% use case API around it, but I'm still going to need to consider, because I have a very narrow view of how I'd ever use these libraries,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I need to find out how everyone else does. HTTP is much simpler. Like, I know how everyone's going to use the library.
Right. Yeah. Because it's, requests can be, there is a specification. The specification for time zones is so much more difficult to understand though.
Yes. I really like
Totally
this
agree.
Moment.js website, how it's auto-updating the comments with the
I actually haven't
values.
seen it.
It's really cool. It has an example line of code. And then as a comment, it has the output of it.
Oh, cool.
And it's updating live because it's JavaScript.
Oh, very nice. I will actually have to, we'll include that in the show notes. I'll go and take a look at that. That sounds great. Moment.js is super powerful. There's a couple others that I've used in the past, and I've actually thought about creating just a little Heroku install to do time zones as a service. So just
time zones as a service.
Just kind of like send a post request with your natural string representation of what the time should be, and it will give you back, I don't know, like what is the seconds, the time since 1970, the seconds since 1970.
The epochs.
Yeah, there you go. The epoch time. If you just send it the string and then it responds back with that. Obviously, that's a superfluous thing to do just to get a time thing back. But to be fair, if you're including the entire library of Moment.js, for example, this would be a smaller request, technically.
Definitely. The API I have in my head, and I haven't done enough research to know if this is proper yet or not. But the workflow that I want, and I think is ideal for everybody, is in your code, all of your time should just always be UTC 100% of the time. Like they don't need any time zone information. This is the time. It's the universal timestamp. This is the time. It's a moment in time.
That's a good place to start for sure.
Yeah, and then you have to have the ability to import a time from a given time zone and to export to a given tone. That's kind of the concept that I have in my head, but I really have to sit down and like read a lot before I can assert that that's even a good idea.
Yeah. So if anyone who is listening to this right now, if you are a functional programmer and you are looking to write a talk about mutability, date times are the perfect case example of mutability gone totally wrong. Because if I create a date on my computer in Chrome with JavaScript, and Kenneth creates one on his computer, and we do it at literally exactly the same time, they could be totally different objects entirely. And they should be the same, but they aren't. And that's just the way it works. It's very strange. There are some things that fix this problem, but not super well.
Yeah, to me, the creation end should always be from a universal reference point.
Right.
And then you go from there, basically.
I would say that it even makes sense to pull that information in a different way than instantiating an object, so that you have to pass in whatever that time is, and maybe that time is available in the environment constantly. I don't know exactly how that would work, though.
Yeah, the time zone for the machine is available in the locale, and that's what gives you different behaviors for these datetime modules, at least in Python.
Yeah.
And to me, I'm trying to do, basically, it's called datetime arithmetic. I'm like, I have a date, I want to do math with a time zone on it. It shouldn't matter what the server. Just ignore the server. My machine does not care.
If you've worked with time zones, then you are probably identifying with all this. If you haven't worked with time zones, then you may think that we're going on and on about this subject, but you haven't worked with time zones.
And I've only worked on them for 4 hours. So
right, only 4 hours for that one project. Yeah.
I still haven't solved it. I'm going to work on it later.
Oh, great. So, I think a lot of this approaching things from the perspective of, this could be more human is really the future of software development, most especially the future of open source development, because, these types of problems are what we need to solve more and more to create value in the open source world. But you mentioned to me before the show that you actually took a break from open source because you were burnt out on open source. You didn't touch any of your open source projects for a year and a half. So I'd love to talk to you about what that burnout is like, and maybe how to avoid that. If for those who are listening, if they're wanting to start a open source project, what to be aware of before they go in, not to scare them off, but hopefully to bring them into the fold here and have them work on open source projects, but also for those who are feeling that burnout, how to maybe get out of it. So we're going to wrap up this first part right here, and we will talk more about burnout and bringing people into the fold of open source in the next episode of Developer Tea. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and thank you to Hired for sponsoring Developer Tea today. If you are looking for a job and you are a developer or a designer, go and check out hired.com/developertea. Of course, that link and every link from this episode will be found in the show notes at spec.fm. If you are enjoying Developer Tea, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. That is the best way to help other developers find the show. Make sure you subscribe if you don't want to miss out on future episodes of Developer Tea, including the second part of this very interview. You can go and do that in whatever podcasting app you use. And of course, every episode of Developer Tea can always be found at spec.fm. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, enjoy your tea.